Billionaire David Sterling thought he had it all, until a foggy morning shortcut led him into a dark alley where a woman was selling twin girls for $500. Shocked, he stepped in, believing he was saving strangers. But the truth waiting to unravel would tear his world apart. Because these weren't just any children. They were his daughters, the very ones he'd been told had died at birth. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now let's begin. David felt something crack inside his chest as he looked at the twins again. The taller one had a small birthmark near her left eye, and she seemed to be the protector, standing slightly in front of her sister. The smaller one clutched a piece of torn fabric, probably once a beloved toy, and kept her eyes fixed on the ground. They were someone's daughters, someone's precious children, reduced to a transaction in a filthy alley. "How much did you say?" David heard himself ask, though his voice sounded strange and distant. "500. Cash only." David's hand moved to his wallet without conscious thought. He had millions in the bank, but right now, $500 felt like the most important money he'd ever spent. The woman's eyes lit up with greedy anticipation as she watched him count out the bills. "They come with you now," she said, snatching the money and counting it twice. No returns, no questions. David crouched down to the girl's level. Up close, he could see they were malnourished, their clothes reeking of neglect. But there was something about their faces, something that tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. "What are your names?" he asked softly. The taller girl looked up briefly. "I'm Emma," she whispered. "This is Sophie. I'm David. Would you like to come home with me?" They nodded silently, and David felt his heart break for children so young who had learned not to hope for better. He took off his expensive wool coat and draped it over both of them, creating a shield against the world that had failed them so catastrophically. The woman had already vanished, leaving David alone with two children he'd just purchased like commodities. The magnitude of what he'd done hit him as they walked toward his car. He'd just committed what was probably several felonies, and he had no idea what came next. But as he helped the girls into his Tesla, their tiny hands cold and trembling, he knew he'd do it again in a heartbeat. The drive to his penthouse was surreal. Emma and Sophie sat in the back seat, pressed together for comfort, watching the city blur past with wide, unblinking eyes. David found himself talking to fill the silence, explaining where they were going, what they would find there. His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. What did he know about children? What do they eat? Where do they sleep? How could he possibly care for two traumatized little girls? His penthouse, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist design, suddenly looked coldly unwelcoming through their eyes. But the girls seemed amazed just to be warm and clean. He drew them a bath, found some of his old t-shirts that could serve as nightgowns, and ordered pizza because he had no idea what else to feed them. Watching them eat was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. They devoured every bite as if they expected it to be their last meal, barely pausing to breathe. When they were finally full, they curled up together on his Italian leather sofa like two rescued kittens, and David felt something fundamental shift inside him. For the first time in years, his penthouse didn't feel empty. Over the following days, David's carefully structured life transformed completely. He canceled meetings, delayed product launches, and shocked his board by announcing he needed to take indefinite family leave. His assistants and executives assumed he'd finally had a breakdown from the pressure. In a way, they weren't wrong. Emma and Sophie brought chaos and joy in equal measure. They turned his sterile living room into a blanket fort kingdom, left toy dinosaurs on his conference table, and asked endless questions about everything from elevators to his computer screens. David found himself shopping for children's clothes, researching pediatricians, and learning the intricate art of braiding hair. But underneath the newfound domesticity, questions gnawed at him. Who were these children really? Where had they come from? What had happened to make them so afraid of loud noises, sudden movements, and adult authority figures? And why, when he looked at their sleeping faces in the morning light streaming through his windows, did he feel like he was looking at something precious he'd lost and miraculously found again? 3 weeks into their new life together, David was helping Sophie with a jigsaw puzzle while Emma practiced writing her alphabet when she looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes and asked, "David, were you ever married?" The question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on the present, on making sure the girls felt safe and cared for, that he'd barely thought about his past. But now, looking at Emma's expectant face, memories came flooding back. "Yes," he said quietly. "I was married to a wonderful woman named Sarah." "Where is she now?" Sophie asked, abandoning the puzzle. David swallowed hard. "She died 5 years ago, when she was having our babies." Emma tilted her head. "You had babies?" "We were going to. But I didn't make it either." The girls exchanged one of their silent twin communications. Then Emma reached over and patted his hand with heartbreaking solemnity. "We're sorry your wife and babies died." That night, after tucking the girls into the guest bedroom he'd hastily converted into a children's paradise, David found himself in his study staring at the framed photo of Sarah on his desk. She'd been radiant in that picture, 7 months pregnant and glowing with anticipation. They just found out they were having twins, identical girls, and had spent hours debating names, planning their nursery, dreaming of the family they'd create together. But Sarah had gone into premature labor at 32 weeks. Complications arose, a massive hemorrhage that the doctors couldn't control. Within hours, David had lost not just his wife, but the daughters they'd never gotten to meet. His mother, Victoria Sterling, a formidable woman who'd built her own real estate empire, had handled all the funeral arrangements while David drowned in grief. He'd been too broken to question any of the details, trusting her to manage what he couldn't bear to face. Now, studying Sarah's photo more carefully, David felt a chill run down his spine. Sarah had the same dark hair as Emma and Sophie, the same delicate bone structure, and her eyes, Sarah's distinctive green eyes with flecks of brown, were exactly like the eyes that looked up at him every day from 2 little faces he'd grown to love. The resemblance could be coincidence. David tried to convince himself of that as he lay awake that night listening to the girls' soft breathing from down the hall. Thousands of children had dark hair and green eyes. The timing could be explained. The girls were about the right age, but so were millions of other 5-year-olds. And the idea forming in his mind was impossible, wasn't it? But the next morning, as he watched Emma concentrate on her cereal with the exact same focused expression Sarah used to get when working on architectural drawings, doubt crept in like a virus in his carefully ordered thoughts. He started researching, using his company's advanced database systems to search for any records of Emma and Sophie. What he found was virtually nothing, as if they'd appeared from nowhere 5 years ago. No birth certificates he could locate, no hospital records, no school enrollments. It was as if someone had deliberately erased their early existence. The woman who'd sold them to him had mentioned they'd been living with a stepmother who couldn't handle them anymore. But when David tried to track down any information about their biological parents, he hit dead ends at every turn. Either the girl's history had been carefully hidden, or there were powerful people who didn't want it found. Days blurred into weeks as David fell deeper into a rabbit hole of investigation while trying to maintain normalcy for Emma and Sophie. He hired the best private detective money could buy, used his tech connections to access databases that weren't supposed to exist, and called in favors from contacts in law enforcement, all while making sure the girls felt secure in their new home, never suspecting that their guardian was slowly unraveling a mystery that could change all their lives forever. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. David's housekeeper, Maria, who'd been with him for years and had embraced the girls like her own grandchildren, mentioned that she'd met their stepmother once at a local grocery store months before David found them. "Poor little ones," Maria said as she folded the girls' laundry. "That woman, she was so mean to them, always yelling, treating them like they were burdens. But she said something strange once, that she never wanted to take them in the first place, that someone important had forced her to." David's blood ran cold. Someone important? She wouldn't say who. But she was scared, Mr. Sterling. Really scared. Like she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't do what they wanted. That night, David made a decision that would either confirm his growing suspicions or prove he was losing his mind. He carefully collected hair samples from the girls' brushes, added his own, and sent them to 3 different laboratories for DNA testing under assumed names. If his impossible theory was correct, the results would show what his heart was already starting to believe, that Emma and Sophie weren't just 2 random children he'd saved from a terrible situation. They were his daughters, his and Sarah's daughters, who who'd somehow survived their traumatic birth and been hidden from him for 5 years. The wait for the results was agonizing. David threw himself into being the best father he could be, teaching the girls to swim in his building's pool, taking them to museums and parks, reading them stories every night. But underneath the domestic bliss, rage was building. If his suspicions were correct, someone had stolen his children, lied about their deaths, and condemned them to years of neglect and abuse. And he had a terrible feeling he knew who. Victoria Sterling had never approved of Sarah. She'd made her disapproval clear from the beginning, calling Sarah unsuitable for the Sterling family name. "She doesn't understand our world," Victoria had said repeatedly. "She'll drag you down, David. Mark my words." But David had loved Sarah's authenticity, her lack of pretension, the way she saw beauty in simple things. She'd been studying architecture when they met, working part-time at a coffee shop to pay her tuition. To David, she represented everything real and genuine that his privileged world lacked. Victoria had orchestrated every detail of the funeral, claiming she was protecting David from additional stress during his grief. She'd insisted on a closed casket service, handled all the paperwork, even selected the cemetery plot. At the time, David had been grateful for her efficiency. Now, he wondered what else she'd efficiently handled. When the DNA results finally came back from all 3 laboratories with identical conclusions, 99.9% probability of paternal relationship, David felt the last pieces of his world rearrange themselves. Emma and Sophie weren't just his daughters by choice. They were his daughters by blood. Children who should have grown up in his home, surrounded by love and security, instead of suffering years of abandonment and abuse. Someone was going to pay for what they'd stolen from all of them. David confronted his mother on a cold December evening in her penthouse office overlooking the bay. Victoria Sterling sat behind her massive mahogany desk like a queen holding court, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression radiating the confidence of someone who'd never been successfully challenged. "David, darling, this is unexpected," she said, not looking up from the contract she was reviewing. "I thought you were still playing house with those charity cases you picked up." The casual cruelty in her words ignited something dangerous in David's chest, but he kept his voice level. "They're not charity cases, Mother. They're your granddaughters." Victoria's pen stopped moving. For the first time in years, David saw a crack in her perfect composure. "I have no idea what you're talking about." David placed the DNA test results on her desk. "Emma and Sophie Sterling, born 5 years ago to Sarah and me. Children you told me died at birth." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire about to snap. Victoria set down her pen with deliberate precision, her hand steady despite the bombshell David had just dropped. "Even if that were true," she said finally, "which I'm not admitting, you have no proof I had anything to do with it." "But you did, didn't you?" David leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "You couldn't stand the thought of Sarah's children carrying the Sterling name. So when she died in childbirth, you saw an opportunity." Victoria's mask slipped completely then, revealing the calculating coldness underneath. Sarah was weak. Common. Those children would have been weak too, dragging down everything our family has built over generations. The admission hit David like a physical blow. "So you stole them. You faked their deaths and gave them away like unwanted pets." "I arranged for them to be placed with a suitable family," Victoria said, regaining some of her composure. "People who could give them appropriate lives, away from the spotlight and pressure of being Sterlings." "Suitable." David's voice cracked. "They were being sold on the street like merchandise, Mother. They'd been abused, neglected, treated like garbage. That's what you called suitable." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Victoria's eyes. "That wasn't. The family I chose was supposed to be different. The family you chose gave them to someone else, who gave them to someone else, until they ended up with a woman who literally sold them to the highest bidder." David stood up, towering over his mother's desk. "My daughters have been to hell and back because of your prejudice and arrogance." Victoria straightened in her chair, trying to reclaim her authority. "I did what I thought was best for you, for the company, for our legacy. You destroyed my family." David's control finally snapped. "You stole my children and let me grieve for 5 years, thinking they were dead. You robbed them of their father, their inheritance, their birthright. You condemned them to lives of suffering because you thought you knew better than God, nature, and basic human decency. Tears were streaming down David's face now, years of suppressed grief and newfound rage pouring out in equal measure. Do you have any idea what they've been through? Emma still wakes up screaming from nightmares. Sophie won't eat unless I promise the food won't be taken away. They flinch when adults raise their voices because they've learned that usually means pain is coming. Victoria looks shaken for the first time David could remember. I didn't know it would turn out like that. The couple I chose seemed perfect. Perfect according to your twisted standards. You mean white, wealthy, socially acceptable. But you didn't bother to actually investigate them, did you? You were so focused on getting Sarah's children out of your life that you didn't care what happened to them afterwards. The truth of his words hit Victoria like a slap. She'd been so consumed with protecting the sterling image that she'd failed to protect the sterling children who needed it most. I want to make this right, she said quietly. Let me help with the girls. I can provide for them. Give them everything they need. They already have everything they need. David cut her off. They have a father who loves them, who will never let anyone hurt them again. What they don't need is you. He gathered up the DNA results and turned toward the door. I won't turn you into the police, because Emma and Sophie have been through enough trauma. But as far as we're concerned, you're dead. Just like you told me they were. Victoria's voice followed him as he walked away. David, please. They're my granddaughters too. I made a mistake. You made a choice, David said without turning around. Now live with it. 6 months later, David's penthouse had been completely transformed. What was once a sterile showcase of wealth and success was now unmistakably a family home. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator, toy castles occupied corners of the living room, and the sound of laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. Emma and Sophie had blossomed under David's care. The haunted look had gradually faded from their eyes, replaced by the natural curiosity and joy of children who finally felt safe. Emma had discovered a love of books and spent hours reading to her sister. Sophie had revealed a talent for art, creating elaborate drawings of their new family that David treasured more than any business award. They still had difficult days. Thunderstorms sent them running to David's bed, and unexpected loud noises could still trigger panic attacks. But they were healing, surrounded by love and security they'd never known before. David had hired the best child psychologist money could buy, but he knew the most important therapy was simply being wanted, being cherished, being home. The legal adoption had been finalized the previous month, though it was really just a formality. DNA tests had already proven what David's heart had known from the moment he saw them that alley. These were his daughters, finally returned to him after 5 years of separation. He'd also hired a team of investigators to track down everyone who'd been involved in trafficking Emma and Sophie through the system. The woman who'd sold them to him was already in prison on unrelated charges, but David made sure the district attorney knew about her other crimes. The original couple, Victoria, had paid to take the girls, had moved to another state and claimed ignorance about what happened next. But David's lawyers were still pursuing them. Victoria Sterling had tried to reach out several times, sending gifts and letters that David returned unopened. She'd attempted to use mutual business contacts to arrange meetings, but David's response was always the same. He had no mother, just as Emma and Sophie had supposedly had no father. The symmetry felt appropriate. On this particular Sunday evening, David sat in his study working on the speech he'd give at the next board meeting. He was stepping back from day-to-day operations to focus on being a father, promoting his longtime deputy to CEO while retaining his position as chairman. The company would survive and thrive without his constant attention, but Emma and Sophie only got one childhood, and he intended to be present for every moment of it. "Daddy." Emma appeared in the doorway, wearing her favorite unicorn pajamas. Behind her, Sophie clutched the stuffed elephant they'd bought during their first shopping trip together. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie can't sleep. She's scared about starting school tomorrow. David saved his work and turned his full attention to his daughters. Tomorrow would be their first day of kindergarten at the prestigious private school he'd selected after extensive research. They'd visited the classroom, met their teacher, and practiced the route a dozen times, but Sophie was still anxious about the transition. "Come here, both of you." The girls climbed onto his lap, fitting together in the chair like they belonged there. David wrapped his arms around them, breathing in the scent of their strawberry shampoo and feeling the solid weight of their small bodies against his chest. "Sophie, do you remember what I told you when you first came home with me?" She nodded against his shoulder. "That you would never let anything bad happen to us again." "That's right. And tomorrow, when you go to school, you'll still be safe. Miss Rodriguez is a wonderful teacher who will take good care of you. And Emma will be right there with you in the same class. And I'll be waiting to pick you up at exactly 3 o'clock. Promise." Sophie's voice was small and vulnerable. "I promise. Cross my heart and hope to fly." It was their special version of the traditional phrase, created during one of their bedtime conversations when Emma had declared that flying would be much better than dying. Sophie giggled despite her nervousness. "That's silly, Daddy." "Maybe so, but it's also true. Nothing will separate us again, girls. Nothing and no one." They sat together in comfortable silence as the city lights twinkled beyond the windows. David thought about all the bedtime stories he'd missed, all the first words and first steps, and first everything that had been stolen from them. But he also thought about all the moments they still had ahead, birthdays and holidays, scraped knees and broken hearts, graduations and weddings and grandchildren he might someday hold in these same arms. "Daddy." Emma's voice was drowsy now. "Yes. I'm glad the mean lady sold us to you, instead of that other man." David's throat tightened. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too. And I'm glad we don't have to be Emma and Sophie anymore," Sophie added sleepily. "I like being Emma Sterling and Sophie Sterling better." They'd chosen to keep the names the girls had grown up with rather than confuse them further, but adding the Sterling surname had made it official in all the ways that mattered. They belonged somewhere now. They belonged to him, and he to them. When both girls had finally dozed off in his arms, David carried them to their bedroom, a princess wonderland they designed together, complete with twin beds shaped like carriages and a ceiling painted to look like a starry sky. He tucked them in carefully, kissing each forehead and whispering the words that had become their nightly ritual. "Sweet dreams, my beautiful girls. Daddy loves you more than all the stars in the sky." As he stood in their doorway watching them sleep, David reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. He'd lost his daughters twice, once to what he thought was death, and once to a betrayal so deep it had nearly broken him. But somehow, against all odds, love had found a way to bring them home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be school events to attend, friendships to navigate, and eventually difficult conversations about their mother and their complicated history. But tonight, they were simply a family, safe and whole, and together under one roof. The billionaire who had once thought success meant corner offices and profit margins had learned that true wealth was measured in bedtime stories and goodnight kisses, in small hands that reached for his when crossing the street, and in two little voices calling him daddy with absolute trust and unconditional love. David Sterling had built an empire worth billions, but his greatest treasure had cost him exactly $500 in a dark alley on a Tuesday morning when he'd chosen compassion over indifference and changed 3 lives forever. As he finally headed to his own bedroom, David's phone buzzed with a message from his assistant about tomorrow's schedule. He glanced at it briefly, then deleted it without reading. Whatever urgent business crisis awaited him could wait until after he dropped his daughters off at their first day of school and made sure they knew their father would be right there waiting when they came home. After all, he'd already missed 5 years of their lives. He wasn't going to miss another moment. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of what truly matters in life, please hit the like button to share the love. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories that will restore your faith in the power of family, forgiveness, and never giving up hope. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hiding in the most unexpected places, waiting for someone brave enough to recognize their true value. See you in the next video.